Are the worship wars still a thing? The fight between traditional and contemporary? I think they still are in some churches. I think even 30 to at least 20 years, I think it's kind of hit the peak around the early 2000s. I still think that we're feeling the effects today. And I want to ask the question, what is the difference between traditional and contemporary worship? Because obviously, people feel adamantly one way or the other. Some people, not everybody, some people are okay with both kinds of worship, but we need to define what are the distinctives of those kinds of worship. Because here's what I think people have thought for at least whenever, because I was alive when the worship wars were going on, and my church had a traditional service and a contemporary service, and the people from the traditional service wanted nothing to do with the contemporary service, and the people from the contemporary service all thought that the traditional service people were just a bunch of old curmudgeonly people. I don't know if everybody felt that way, but I'm just generalizing here. I think people may have misunderstood what the shift was in going from traditional worship to contemporary worship. And I think a lot of people assumed that it was just the music, but I think that there was a little bit more to it than that might be beneficial for us now that we are at least moving past the worship wars. I think we can look back and evaluate and say, what was the shift that happened? Because we are clearly in the contemporary phase of worship, whatever that means. So let's talk about the shift. Let's talk about some of the defining elements of the shift. And I want to give you some of my own observations first, and then we're going to be looking at this book, Lovin' on Jesus, an intentionally corny name, I believe, and we'll be talking about what was discussed in that book because they give some concrete elements of the shift from traditional to contemporary. So let's talk about number one. What is the shift? What was the main shift? And most people think it's the music, right? And they're right. There was a decided shift in the musical style from traditional music to contemporary music, and there are different elements within those. One of those being the instrumentation changed. We went, really, if you go back like traditional, there were no instruments in some churches because they didn't have the means to have those instruments in their church. So it went from a cappella to organ is probably what you think of whenever you think of traditional music, or in more modern times, as we've kind of shifted a little bit further away from traditional, we landed on piano, right? But do not go to guitar. Do not go to a full band. It is a choir, and it is organ or piano. Contrast that with contemporary music. What is contemporary music? It is full bands, or at least an acoustic guitar, right? But in a lot of churches, we think of full bands, we think of drums, guitars, bass. I won't bore you with this. You already know all this stuff. There was a musical difference. We shifted from choirs and organs to full bands and lead singers. Now, that is the most obvious shift, and I think that that's the one most people think that they're fighting over. I don't like the new music, so get that new contemporary stuff out of here. Or conversely, I don't like that old boring hymn stuff with the organ. Now, it is my theory that it was not just a musical shift, but there was actually a much larger shift that happened at least alongside the traditional music versus contemporary music shift. And that is that not only did we shift in music, but we also shifted in liturgy of our services. And I think that at the time, people, I never heard anybody express this at the time. I think that we were distracted by the music, or perhaps we just didn't have the language, at least in the churches that I was at, to explain the shift, or maybe it happened gradually and we didn't realize it in the moment. Whatever the reason is, I think that there's been a shift, not just in the musical style, but in the liturgy of our worship services. And here's what I mean. Let's take a look at a traditional worship service. And I'm not saying everybody does it this way, but this is a traditional understanding all the way back to the Roman Catholic Church, to the Reformation, to the Westminster Confession, their understanding of the order of worship, even up to probably the 80s or something. Worship remained virtually unchanged, even during the Reformation, there was, at least the liturgy, I should say, not the purpose of worship, but the liturgy of worship remained virtually unchanged. They all had the same elements. Those elements were a call to worship where we recognize the greatness of God, a time of confession where we recognize our sinfulness, an assurance of pardon where we are reminded of the freedom that we have in Christ through his sacrifice. There was thanksgiving, where we give thanks for the forgiveness that we receive. There was instruction, where we hear the word of God. There was perhaps communion, where now that we are brought into the family of God and we receive instruction, now we share in communion with him, reminded that we have fellowship with him, and then we dedicate ourselves to the message that we received, and we are sent out and blessed to go do the work that God has given us. Do you see the liturgy? That's what I consider a traditional liturgy. Let's contrast that with the contemporary liturgy today. And I'm going to simplify this a lot. I'm simplifying both. But what's a contemporary service look like today? We welcome people. Hey, church, let's stand and worship together. And then what do? We sing 3 songs. And then somebody comes up and welcomes people and does the announcements and prays. And then we collect giving, if you still do that at your church. But some of us don't even do that because we just do it online now. And then what happens? We sing another song. The pastor comes up, preaches, and then we sing one final song and go home. And so we can contrast those 2 liturgies together, and it's not just for the purpose of being like, okay, here is the different liturgical elements of worship are different, but I think underlying the liturgical elements changing was a fundamental shift in our understanding of what corporate worship is. And this is big, by the way. This isn't just a style of music sort of thing. This is, I thought corporate worship, I thought God's people gathered for this reason on Sunday, and now we gather for this reason. And here is what I think the shift has been. We have shifted from a traditional understanding of corporate worship was for the purpose of representing the gospel story, meaning we work our way through the gospel story. You see this in all of the older liturgies, like I laid out: adoration, confession, assurance of pardon, instruction, being sent out, plus the other elements in there as well. We have shifted from a representation of the gospel story, using that to worship God, to I want to experience God's presence through music. And then there's going to be some teaching as well. I'll receive instruction, but it's experience God's presence through our musical time of worship, receive some instruction, experience God's presence again, sent out. So we have shifted from a representation of the gospel story to experience God's presence through extended times of musical worship, receive some instruction from the Bible, and then we sing again to experience God's presence. And in this video, it's not my purpose to comment on which one of those is right or wrong. I just want us to see the shift. We used to represent the gospel every Sunday, and I mean that in our liturgical structure, not just saying the gospel, which contemporary churches still do, but not just saying the gospel, but reenacting the gospel, the worship service as a gospel reenactment versus I want to encounter God through extended times of musical worship. Now, that brings me to what I think is a third distinctive of the traditional versus contemporary worship argument, and that is that we have seen a shift in the understanding of God's presence. And we even saw it within the traditional style itself before we moved to contemporary worship. But along with the contemporary worship movement, I think that there was also a shift in the understanding of God's presence. So it has always been a debate in the church. How is God present in our gatherings? And I've talked about this on my channel before. But essentially, we went from Roman Catholic understanding God is present in the Eucharistic elements, the bread and the wine are the body and blood of Christ. That is the real presence of Jesus. Then when the Reformers came along, and I know that I'm abbreviating this, somebody called me out on this before, I know that Luther and Calvin believed that the presence was still in the communion, just in different ways than the Catholic Church believed. But eventually, a lot of people ended up at the Zwinglian understanding that communion was a memorial. There was no longer the physical or spiritual presence in the communion elements, and that means that the presence of God was in His Word, that God speaks through His Word, that we experience God through His Word. So we've already seen this shift moving from Catholicism to late Reformers, I'll call them, from God's presence in communion to God's presence in the Word, and now the next shift that I've seen is that we moved from communion to God's presence in the Word, to God's presence in music. And I think that that is a distinctive of contemporary worship, is that we now view our musical times of worship, in some cases, the musical act itself of bringing the presence of God to us. It used to be in the Eucharist when the Catholic priest would hold up the elements and it turned into the body of Christ. And then it used to be in Luther and Calvin's understanding, still in the communion elements, whether a spiritual presence, or we are taken to heaven through the Spirit, Calvin's understanding. I've talked about that in the previous video. We shifted from that understanding of God's presence in communion to God's presence in the Word. God speaks to us through the Word. As the Word is preached, it is as if Christ is preaching to us, therefore Christ is present in His Word. We have shifted from that to, during the musical times of worship, God is present. And once again, I'm not here to comment on which of those I think is correct. I'm just trying to point out what I've seen as the shift. I think it's good to understand how theology has developed over the years, and we can either recognize things that shouldn't be in the present, or we can recognize mistakes that we've made in the past. It goes both ways. Now, those are my observations. Obviously, there was a change in musical style. I also believe that there was a change in liturgy, and that liturgy meant that the purpose of corporate worship changed from representing the gospel story or reenacting the gospel story to experiencing God's presence through times of musical worship. And number 3, there was a shift from God's presence in communion to God's presence in His Word to now God's presence through our musical times of worship. Now, I told you I was going to talk about this book as well, Lovin' on Jesus, a purposefully cheesy name, I think, once again. Lim Swee Hong and Lester Ruth lay out a concise history, I think it says that here, a concise history of contemporary worship. So it's like the first academic attempt at tracing the history of the shift from traditional to contemporary music. So I'll leave a link to that down in the description below, but what I want to talk about from this book is they actually list out 9 elements of what makes contemporary worship. And I think that all of these 9 elements are interesting to consider. They start out with number 1, there was an increased focus on using contemporary, non-archaic language. That means that they got rid of the thous and these and tried to put it not just in the vernacular, but in a way that would connect with people on a contemporary basis. Like, if I was talking to you in church, I would be talking to you the same way that I would be talking to you at the grocery store. Because back in traditional, at least in the super traditional ways, like they would be like, "Thou God art the greatest," right? Something like that. And now we would be like, "God, you are a great God." So that is the purposeful shift from archaic language, for the sake of archaic language, to sound grand and glorious, to contemporary language that connects with people. Number 2, a dedication to relevance regarding contemporary concerns and issues in the lives of worshipers. And that means that now we plan our services, and I've even talked about this on my channel before. We want to know what's going on in the lives of our people, of our church, and we want to speak directly into their circumstances. And I know that I've used that language before, so I'm like, yes, this is probably an element of contemporary worship, because what did worship used to be? It used to be a retelling, a reenactment of the gospel story, really with no concern for what's going on in your, there was concern for what was going on in your daily life, but the service wasn't structured around that. So I think of like just a big contrast today would be, okay, we're retelling the gospel story, traditional versus contemporary, where it's like, here's how to have a better marriage according to the Bible. Husbands, treat your wives this way. Now, you might get that instruction in the traditional service, but to structure your entire service around contemporary issues that apply directly to people's lives was not something that happened in the traditional service. Number 3, a commitment to adapt worship to match contemporary people, sometimes to the level of strategic targeting. People sang the same songs in traditional worship for hundreds of years, and they did not change the style of those songs. It lasted for a long time, and now what happens to our worship music? We're changing the style all the time. And why are we doing so? We're doing so to, what do we say? We want to implement a contemporary worship service so that we can connect with younger people, right? And once again, I'm not commenting on whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is an element of the contemporary worship movement. I remember watching that Jesus Revolution movie not too long ago, and I think of what was the shift. And this is sort of the musical shift, just put in a different light that I talked about earlier. What was the shift in that movie? It was like, hey, these hippies are in town. We want to give them a place to be at church. And to do so, we're going to utilize their music because their music connects with that group of people. And I think that's an example of the shift to match the music to the preferences of the people of the time so that we can strategically target them so that they will come to church and want to participate in worship because there will be music that they like. So those were the fundamental presumptions of contemporary worship. They were the things that guided contemporary worship. We don't use archaic language. We are concerned about the specific issues in people's lives, and we want the music to match their preferences. Now we move on to the actual musical differences. So, number 4, using musical styles from current types of popular music. So this kind of piggybacks on the last one. Not only do we want our music to match what people will enjoy, but we borrow from popular music trends in order to facilitate that basic presumption that I talked about in the last point. So now we are like, it's really popular to have this sound of music. And so we're going to take that pop music vibe and use it in a Christian context. And now church music was meant to emulate music outside of the church. Number 5, they say an element of contemporary worship was the extended times of uninterrupted congregational singing. Now, we used to have music broken up by liturgy. Like the music was to support the liturgical elements. We would confess, and then we'd sing a song of confession. We would recognize the greatness of God. I have those backwards, but we would recognize the greatness of God. We would sing a song about the greatness of God. Now, music has become the liturgy, where we just sing 3 songs in a row, 4 songs in a row, however many you sing at your church. That is a shift from traditional to contemporary. Number 6, a centrality of the musicians in the liturgical space and in the leadership of the service. So before, the pastor used to get up and they would facilitate the service. Now we have worship pastors, worship leaders. This is my role in my church. I facilitate if we have liturgical elements, but I am facilitating the worship gathering. It used to be the pastor would lead everything and the choir would just sing when it was time to respond to whatever liturgical element they're in, and now we have the actual lead musician leading the gathering. The third category of elements is called the behavioral elements. So this is number 7. There are greater levels of physical expressiveness. Hong and Ruth, who wrote this book, see that as a defining characteristic of contemporary worship. That once contemporary worship came along, physical expressiveness in worship was more prevalent. Number 8, a preference for informality. It used to be in traditional worship, things were more high church and grandiose. And now there is informality. We don't dress up to go to church. We wear flannel and jeans. We don't sit like this in church, I guess. We kind of have comfortable chairs and lean back. The pastor's not behind a pulpit. They stand at a table or they have their sermon memorized and they're up there sitting on a stool and they're just talking. There's informality in worship now. And number 9, and this falls under the key dependency heading, we are dependent, we are reliant upon electronic technology. So this would be like going from hymnals to slides with lyrics on the TV screen. Or this would be organs versus electric guitars, or pianos versus electric guitars, or whatever it is. So my point in this video was to hopefully allow us to see that there's been a shift, not just in the music of worship, from traditional to contemporary, but the more I think about it, there's been a shift in many different elements, and I'm not even commenting on whether those shifts are good or bad. I think it's at least interesting to talk about, to see the shift, that it wasn't just musical, but there were a lot of other elements to it as well. I think it's also beneficial to help us learn from the wisdom of the past. And I think that there's also a danger in us being like, well, church hasn't developed since the 1500s and we just need to freeze it in the 1500s because it was perfect once it was reformed during the Reformation. I don't think that that's necessarily a healthy view either. I think that there's also been a lot of wisdom over the past 500 years. So I think the goal of this video was just to help us start to understand, okay, there's been a marked shift over the past 50 years from the 70s to right now in our worship. Some of those changes were probably good. Some of them probably moved too fast. And in the next few videos, I'm actually going to be talking about one of those changes. I'm going to be talking about liturgy in worship and why I think that that is important and that we get back to it and not just sing 3 songs, have our pastor preach, sing another song, and go home. But I think that it is important that we retell, reenact, remind ourselves of the gospel story. So in the next video next week, I'm going to be talking about that. So if you aren't subscribed, I never asked for this, but subscribe down below so you don't miss out on that. And also, if you want to improve your worship leading, I've got something free for you. It's called the 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading audio training. It's a free audio training where I walk you through 5 simple things that you can do before this Sunday that I think will instantly improve your worship leading. They aren't hard to do. You just have to know them and make the conscious effort to do them. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Till I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.